G'day, I'm Rob Malicki. Welcome to Hong Kong and welcome to this Mobility 101 video on partnerships, agreements, balances and due diligence. It's scorching hot here today. Got my Cobra. We're going to make a start on this super important topic that you need to know in terms of working with all of your partners around the world. What's a partnership anyway? Well, universities essentially collaborate with tons of different types of organisations and individuals all around the world, and this covers a whole range of different activities across the breadth of what universities do. So it's things like research, it can be things like commercial activities, it can be things in relation to student movements. And in terms of our space, outbound mobility, partnerships cover a range of different types of mobility options. Now, the most common type of partnership that you're going to hear referred to is, of course, an exchange agreement. Exchange agreement is where two universities, different parts of the world, agree to swap students, so to speak. But that's not the only type of partnership that universities now have. Universities now work extensively with third-party providers. Third-party providers are independent organisations that facilitate different types of student experiences. So that might be independent academic short courses at universities overseas, such as AIM Overseas. You've got internship providers, so organisations that specifically organise internships overseas for university students. You've got volunteering organisations, organisations that look after things like clinical placements and practical placements, education and health. And then you've got organisations that can do a whole bunch of all of these types of experiences, like CIS Australia, for example. There are also other sorts of service providers that universities work with in the outbound mobility space. So that might be the Global Society, for example. It can also be travel agents or other organisations that provide support, for example, in setting up and running study tour activities. There's a whole range of different types of partnerships that universities form around outbound mobility. Typically, where there's a partnership, there needs to be a formal signed agreement. And we'll get into a little bit more detail about formal signed agreements, particularly in relation to semester exchange. But traditionally, a partnership is based around an agreement, at least a verbal or like emailed agreement, if not a formal signed document. These things are important in terms of forming partnerships with organisations. Let's talk a little bit more about what it takes to establish new partnerships and create good partnerships. Oh, it's cooking. Partnerships can take a long time to create and to form, and often they're formed initially on the basis of like personal interactions and relationships formed at things like conferences such as NAFSA, EAIE in Europe, and even the Australian International Education Conference. So these are places where universities have the opportunity to collaborate, to meet, have initial discussions, and to look for synergies. And I suppose that's one of the most important things about any kind of partnership, is that there needs to be some sort of obvious mutually beneficial synergy in any potential relationship. So looking for that kind of strategic benefit is the first part of creating a new partnership. After that, it's also important to then consider some of the macro factors to make sure that this is going to be a relationship that actually works. So in the case of like semester exchange agreements or exchange agreements in general, is the university sort of similarly ranked to your institution? Does that institution have subject areas, discipline areas that actually meet needs of your students that either match or where you've currently got a gap? Are they proactive? Are they good communicators? Are there interesting opportunities outside of semester exchange where you can potentially deepen that relationship as it goes forward? These are all sorts of things that need to be considered as part of creating a new partnership. One of the things that works well is that universities refer each other to interesting institutions where there may be important matches. So, you know, this industry has been going for a long, long time and there's a lot of shared knowledge. So very often it's a fantastic opportunity for one university to say to another, hey, you know what, these guys over here, they do something that might actually help you. And that's a really compelling way because it removes some element of having to like start from scratch. And wherever you can make that process easier is obviously a good thing. Now, as we were saying, partnerships often don't just cover one area of activity. Normally, it's not just about semester exchange, but an agreement, a partnership might also cover many other areas. It might cover short courses, it might cover research. In fact, very often will cover research. It may also cover things like student recruitment, so inbound study abroad, inbound full degree programs. All these things can be bundled up into a partnership and into an agreement. So considering all of these things when establishing new partnerships is very important. It's something that strategically universities are very interested in because there's a lot of work that goes in behind the scenes to make these things work. So the more opportunities and options that are available for universities, the more likely a partnership is to succeed. I'd like to tell you about an important part of creating new partnerships and agreements, which is called due diligence. So what is due diligence? Due diligence is the super important process of making sure that everything underneath the surface is exactly the way it appears. So essentially it's like risk management to ensure that everything is in place before a partnership is signed. How do we do due diligence? Well, most universities now have got really formalised risk management procedures and processes in place to ensure that partnerships are signed and handled correctly. And this will include things like doing a site visit to make sure that the facilities that are available are as they should be. It can be things like checklists to ensure that accommodation is up to scratch, that they've got appropriate health and safety measures for students, orientation things, considerations are as they should be. There are numerous checklists that are available, including in the Outbound Mobility Best Practice Guide for Australian Universities, a series of checklists to help universities do their due diligence. Now, critically, due diligence should be done not just on exchange partners and other universities, but they should be done on all organisations. It can be a somewhat laborious process because if you want to go and create a new internship opportunity in a really specific niche for a specific group of students and you need to go and find a third-party provider in Hong Kong who offers internships, you may need to do due diligence on that partner. Why is it so important? Because it is about risk mitigation. And when students are traveling around the world, they're outside their comfort zone, they haven't got their regular support networks, having done that due diligence can mean the difference between a student running into a problem or being A-OK. So due diligence is a critical part of creating new partnerships and agreements. So you've scoped out a new partnership that you want to sign, you've done your due diligence, we're now ready to sign an agreement. Every university is slightly unique in the way that they actually go through signing agreements. Firstly, universities may be centralised or decentralised. Most commonly these days, universities are increasingly centralised. That means a central international office or some sort of unit takes care of the process of managing those agreements. But not always. Faculties also can have a lot of autonomy in the types and nature of agreements that they can sign for themselves. When it comes to actually signing new agreements, we do want to make sure that these agreements, these partnerships have got the best likelihood of success. And that's why communication, internal communication, is super important in terms of making sure everybody's on the same page with the types of agreements that are going to be signed and what's the outcome that we're looking for out of this partnership. Defining those things in advance and making sure that all the stakeholders are kept up to date are critical issues to consider. Now, who signs exchange agreements and other partnerships? It kind of depends from university to university. In some cases, it's signed off by the Vice-Chancellor themselves, the very top of the institution. Very often it's signed by like an internationally responsible Deputy Vice-Chancellor or Pro-Vice-Chancellor, but in some cases it's also delegated down to Directors International or to Deans of Faculties. So depending on your university, the person who will actually sign that agreement will vary, and it can also vary depending on the type of agreement being signed. And all of this is to say that whoever signs the agreement, whoever owns the agreement, it's kind of a secondary issue to making sure that there is always really good communication around the types of partnerships, the outcomes we're looking to get from them, and when we are signing new agreements that everyone's on the same page. So let's have a think then about what that means in terms of storing information and data about partnerships. Well, having some sort of centralised database is obviously advantageous. Spreadsheets, you know what, they just don't cut it anymore. You actually need to have a really good database that monitors all the different types of agreements that you have and the different types of things that are covered under those agreements. So not just things like renewal dates, but is the agreement in question about research, as well as exchange, as well as short-term programs, as well as recruitment. All of those things need to be specified out. So having a central repository of information that can be accessed by both central staff and faculty staff is enormously advantageous. Whoa. Let's talk about balances. So balances are typically about semester exchange programs, and that is the fact that when it comes to semester exchange, you're trying to balance the number of outbound students with the number of inbound students. And over a specified period of time, usually a couple of years, those two numbers need to actually match up. So universities and agreements typically allow for some sort of latitude when it comes to agreements being out of balance, and it's a huge challenge because if you've got a university to which you send a ton of students but you're not bringing students in, that balance is going to mean that eventually the agreement is no longer viable. Obviously the converse is also true. If you're bringing in tons of students from one university but you're not sending enough students out to that institution, then that agreement eventually is going to burn up because things aren't in balance, they're not synchronized, and it just won't work. Now, what does this mean? Well, firstly, semester exchange is an incredible, impactful experience, and exchanging students on a one-to-one basis is what exchange agreements were originally designed to do. But increasingly, universities are looking for clever ways to actually work around that direct one-to-one exchanging of students to balance out agreements. This is by using things like summer and winter schools, winter exchange programs. So a student can go, for example, in July or January, do a month-long course at a university overseas, and that might be used towards the balance in that agreement. So when this sort of arrangement is in place, a student doing a short course, a short-term exchange at a partner university, might count for only half or 1/3 of a full semester exchange place. So this is what we typically call like 2-for-1, 3-for-1, or 4-for-1 kind of agreements, where the number of students going on short-term programs eventually evens out to one regular semester length program. Really important because this allows you to find interesting ways around the challenge of balancing agreements with certain partners. Why is that important anyway? Well, a university, for example, might be strategically important as one of your partners. But if, let's say for research purposes or for some sort of commercialization purposes. But if the exchange agreement is out of balance, you can run into problems. So we need to find clever ways in order to match up those balances to exchange perhaps students on short programs, like 2, 3, 4 students going out on a short-term program for one inbound student to keep everything running smoothly.